All right, this thing is pretty cool, and it is totally worth it just for the camera. Unless Hey, Justin Veruzzo here from Veruzzo Productions, and today I am talking all about the iPhone 13 Pro Max. This is my long-term review. I've been using this phone for just about a month. I was lucky to pretty much get it on day one, and I've been using it every day since. If you already watched my review on the iPhone 12 Pro Max, you should probably skip towards the end of this video where I talk about the camera, because there's only really two key differences between the 12 Pro and the 13 Pro. One of those is the 120 Hertz ProMotion display that's available on the 13 Pro, which is not on the 12. And then the other difference is that the 13 Pro has a cinema mode, which you've probably seen commercials, and if you watch the Apple event, you've learned a little bit about it. And it also supports ProRes, and it also has a macro lens on the camera. So pretty much all of the changes with this new model all revolve around the camera. Other than the camera and that little ProMotion difference, they're pretty much identical form factor phones from the 12. With that said, I will rehash all of my thoughts from the 12 Pro Max for those of you, I realize many, coming from a 10 or an 11 or maybe even a 6, 7, or 8. So anyone who's been following Apple products probably has noticed that they've put a lot of effort into trying to be an environmentally conscious company. I'm a little bit torn as to whether that's their real motive or boosting their profit by not including a charger, not including the headphones anymore. It makes the packaging a fraction of the size that it used to be, which means they can fit twice as many phones in half the size of a container, and they can dramatically cut costs. The packaging weighs less, it's dimensionally smaller, it's less to ship it from the warehouses to the end user. There's a lot of reasons to try to shrink down the packaging and of course save the money on not including a charger. While it may only be $1 or $2 on Apple's end, it equates to tens if not hundreds of millions of dollars, especially when spawned over multiple generations of a new phone. So one thing that I always found ironic is they always speak about all of their environmental consciousness, but every phone that I've gotten is always wrapped in plastic. Surprisingly, this is the first new iPhone that I've bought that is not wrapped in plastic, and instead it had a little pull tab to seal the box, which was a nice touch, especially if you're trying to be an eco-friendly company. It's something that I think they probably could have done a long time ago, and it's something that, let's be frank, Entenmann's Donuts has been doing since I was a little kid. So there are more ways to seal a package other than just plastic. But I will give them that there was no plastic on this packaging, and the little tab works, and of course, it is just your standard quality Apple box. Powering up your phone for the first time, especially if you are on iOS 14 or iOS 15 now on your old phone, it's never been easier to transfer the contents from your old phone to your new phone. Apple really has this locked down. If you're moving from an Android phone to an Apple phone, it probably is a little bit more complicated. With that said, I personally do not have an Android phone, and I've never made that transition anytime in the last few years, so I'm not sure what that's like right now. But I can tell you, going from an Apple phone to another Apple phone, you turn it on, you set the two phones next to one another, and you are off to the races, and your data automatically transfers over, and within about an hour or so, you are ready to roll with your new phone with all of your apps and all of your settings on it. One thing that I want to remind people of, because it's become super popular and it's a mistake that I've made in the past, many websites now use two-factor authentication, and if you use an authenticator app like Google Authenticator, make sure that you copy those authentications from your old phone to your new phone, because it's not part of the automatic process. And if you lose those authentication codes from Google Authenticator, for example, you may not be able to get into websites. I'm also going to add that for crypto wallets. I know a lot of crypto wallets have unique keys that are specific to the phone that will not transfer over, and you want to make sure that you have that information, especially before you delete your old phone and send it back. This way, if you happen to forget something, if you forgot to carry over a crypto wallet or you forgot to carry over a Google Authenticator, you can still authenticate and still access your wallet on your old phone to get whatever information you need to bring it over to the new phone. So that's just a little word of caution, because I did forget to do it on going from my 11 to my 12, and it was a little bit of a headache, and it took some time to go back and dig up recovery modes for the websites that I had lost in the Google Authenticator app. I am happy to see that Google Authenticator now does have a way to transfer your codes from one phone to another phone, which is fairly recent improvement that did not exist, as far as I'm aware, just a year or two ago. So one thing I absolutely loved about the iPhone 12 was this new square design, which I guess you could say is also an old design. When I came into the Apple ecosystem, the first iPhone I had gotten was an iPhone 6 Plus, which was of course one of their larger phones, but it was when they made the transition to what was the design from the 6, 7, and 8s and 10s and onward. However, I never ever used a case on any of my phones, and this was the first time that the phone felt so slippery and so poorly ergonomically designed in terms of really being able to hold it with a confident grip. It was the first time that I really felt compelled to get a case for my phone. And I had had an iPhone case on every phone since the 6 until I got the 12. When they went back to this, and it kind of sounds crazy to talk about, but this is made from stainless steel, and it's kind of sticky. It's grippier than aluminum. So if you were to take the side of this phone and rub it with your hand, and then you do the same thing, it'll be very, very slippery on any of the older phones, but on a 12 and a 13 with this new stainless steel, it actually gives a really confident grip. And now I use this phone without a case, as I did with the iPhone 12, and it just makes the whole experience better. I just hate cell phone cases. I've never been a fan of it. I've never really dropped or broken a phone before. I'm pretty careful with my electronics, and I do have Apple Care, so if God forbid I did drop it and smash it once, I could just go get a new one, and then I probably would get a case because I'd feel like an idiot. If you're clumsy with your phone, definitely get a case. But if you're a fairly confident person that doesn't drop your phone often, ditch the case on this, man, because it really feels great to just hold this phone and not have to have a case on it. And, you know, cases cover up. They're cool phones. They look nice, and, you know, it would be a drag to have to cover that up. The next thing I want to talk about is battery life. One of the things that Apple announced was that this new iPhone 13 Pro would have better battery life. I believe it was up to 20% better than the iPhone 12. Now I'm going to go back for a second, and I will say that ever since I have had my iPhone 6 Plus, the plus size phones have always had bigger batteries than their smaller counterparts, and all of those batteries have always gotten through a full day. There were a few instances with maybe the 6 and the 7 where if I had started at 4:30 or 5 in the morning, I had a lot of screen time, a lot of phone calls, and I was going till 11 o'clock at night, I would maybe have the phone die once or twice the entire time I owned them. However, since at least the iPhone XS Max, I have never had the battery die once. Now, I do charge my phone every night before I go to bed. I throw it on the charger. I actually use the Belkin 3-in-1 charger that was promoted last year in the Apple event, and if you want to check out, I'll put a link to the review I did on that, because it is a really nice charger, and I've really fallen in love with it because it can charge my phone and it charges my watch on one device, which is fantastic. So simply put, the battery life is absolutely awesome on this phone. And I can't imagine how you would kill the battery in a day unless you are literally on it every second of every day, running GPS, playing games. Then maybe you'd need a bump charge later in the day, but I can tell you, as a above average user, I certainly use my phone more than average, I think. My screen time usually hovers around 3 to 4 hours a day over the course of a week. Some weeks it's less, some weeks it's more, but I would say on average, it's probably about 3 hours a day that I'm looking at my phone. And in addition to that, I'm always, running little apps. I might be running GPS if I'm on the road. I just never have an issue. And this phone especially, I can do it in a full day. I'll wake up at 5 a.m., check my emails, go through my inbox. I'll go on some road trips where I'm GPSing, and I will come home, go through some more emails, and by the time I go to bed, this phone will still be at like 80%. So I could probably go 2, maybe even 3 days without charging this thing, which is really, really cool. Now, if you are someone who forgets to charge your phone phone at night or you just don't bother, it might be a different story. I mean, I can't speak for everyone. I can only speak from my own experience, which is I do charge my phone every night, and every iPhone over the last few years has easily gotten me through a day with zero concern that the battery is going to die before the end of the day. One of the other things is this phone, of course, does have the OLED display. The OLED display was introduced with the iPhone 10 and has been an option on the premium phones ever since. OLED technology really blows everything away. I yet to see anything that comes close to it in terms of the richness, the contrast. It's just, they're fantastic displays. I also have an LG OLED TV, which is just breathtaking. I've had it for a few years, and I still have never gotten bored of it. Every time I watch 4K HDR content, I am just blown away by the quality. And this does not disappoint. The 4K HDR video that this camera records looks absolutely gorgeous in 10-bit watching it back on this OLED screen. So speaking of screen technologies, I'm not going to get into all the interesting pros and cons of OLED. I just know I love it and I would never go with anything else. I did recently see the new iPad Pro with the micro LED display, and I do have to say that's probably the closest I've seen anything come to the contrast of an OLED display and the black levels of an OLED display. However, it was not mine. I didn't have a lot of time with it, so I didn't really do all the tests that I would normally do where OLED really shines and most other technologies really fall off a cliff. Since we're talking about screens, I want to talk a little bit about the ProMotion 120 Hertz variable refresh rate that is on this new phone. Now, I'm not someone who's really hugely concerned with refresh rates. I don't do gaming. On my TVs and stuff, I always keep the refresh rate at 60 Hertz because the 120 and 240 thing, I don't like watching movies. Movies are filmed at 24 frames a second, and I really prefer to see them in 24 frames a second, and I don't want to see them at 240 Hertz where they look smooth and you don't get the motion blur, and it just doesn't look realistic anymore. It starts to make movies look like video games. When you're scrolling on a phone, it's a little bit different. I'll say going from an iPhone 12 Pro Max to the 13 Pro Max, I really didn't see the difference. But after I used this new phone for 2 weeks, I did pick up my old phone before I was sending it back to Apple and went through it. And I did notice the downgrade and the fluidity of scrolling on the system. So to me, it's more something felt than really seen, but the way Apple designed it was really cool because it's variable, which means that the refresh rate is only increasing when it needs to. If you're looking at a static image, the refresh rate is really not all that important. When you start moving things around and scrolling, that's when that refresh rate will bump up to 120 Hertz, and it will make for a very smooth, fluid motion on text and stuff and graphics on the screen. Would I spend extra money to get 120 Hertz ProMotion display? Absolutely not. I never would. Would I decide between the 12 and the 13 if ProMotion was the only factor? I would just stick with the 12. If that was the only thing that I thought would pull me to a 13, I would not pay a penny extra to have the ProMotion 120 Hertz over the standard display that was on the iPhone 12. That's me personally. If you do a lot of gaming on your phone, maybe that's a little bit more important and it would be worth the upgrade, but I just don't find it to be that much better. It's incredibly subtle, but it just does create a little bit better of an experience when you're using the phone. One thing that not too many people talk about is the fact that these new phones have dual SIMs, and this is good for a couple of unique situations. If you have a work phone and a home phone, for example, you can actually put one eSIM and one physical SIM or two eSIMs on the phone, and then you never ever have to carry two phones. You can actually have two separate phone numbers, and I was actually impressed. T-Mobile has a free trial where you can try their service without a credit card for 30 days. T-Mobile, where I live, is really not that great. I'm on Verizon. Lately, Verizon's coverage has not been that great, but T-Mobile was no better, and it was actually a lot worse. But I did try the trial just to see what it would be like to have two SIM cards. I was really surprised to see how well you can separate the two accounts just about everywhere. You can assign contacts to one SIM card and different contacts to the other SIM card. You see both tower signal strengths on the phone. It transfers over to CarPlay, so you see the two strengths of each signal there. You can set one phone number to just use data and the other one not to. So if you have unlimited data, for example, on your work phone and you want to browse the web, you can set it to use the data on that phone. It's a pretty powerful feature that I could see very beneficial for certain people. If you're in a really spotty cell area and cellular service is paramount to your business or to your job, it is possible that you could have both Verizon service and AT&T just for the sake of having that dual coverage. Obviously, that's expensive. For most people, that's going to run to have two cell plans, probably $200, $220 a month. But again, if it's critical to your gig and it's critical to your job, or you're just really nervous that you're in a lot of areas with poor cell service with one carrier or the other, yeah, you could do it. You could spend the money and you could have two carriers, AT&T and Verizon, for example, on one phone, and it works well. So speaking of cell service, I want to talk a little bit about 5G. I realize that many of you may be coming from a 4G LTE phone and now you're moving into a 5G phone. With that said, you should know that 5G in a lot of ways is I don't want to call it a scam, but it is really marketed poorly to make you believe that it is the next generation of communications beyond 4G. But here's the reality of it. 5G in most areas is going to be about the same, or in some cases, like I experienced, 5G is absolutely worse than 4G is with Verizon where I live in New York. So in my case, I've actually disabled 5G on my phone because anytime I connect to 5G towers, I tend to get worse service and slower service than when I am just connected with LTE. So that is just something to keep in mind. Now, if you live in very specific areas, Midtown Manhattan, if you are in the city center of Boston or the North End, those are places I've personally been that have what's called millimeter wave 5G. It has a slightly different icon that you can see here that will show up in the corner to indicate that you're actually in millimeter 5G wavelength. It is ridiculously fast. That 5G is what you would hope all 5G would be. Unfortunately, the way it's structured, it only covers very, very small sections of the most densely populated cities in the country. So you are not ever going to be in a rural area and have millimeter 5G service. Don't wait for it. It's not coming. You're not going to get it. The way these things work, they're basically almost like little routers on telephone poles, like every 50 or 100 feet. It's kind of crazy technology. If you are lucky enough to live in one of those neighborhoods, it is insanely fast. I mean, you could easily run your home internet servers, your business, you could run anything off of that 5G. And it is very cool to think that for people who are reliant on wired internet, whether you have Fios or whether you have a cable company that provides internet, or God forbid you have satellite internet because you're really out in the middle of nowhere, it's nice to know that 5G does have the potential to really power your entire home, which would allow cell phone companies to kind of invade into that market. And hopefully with some competitiveness, it could even bring down the cost of broadband. I want to talk about the camera because, quite frankly, this is what excited me and wanted me to get a new phone. I'm recording this video on a Blackmagic 6K in RAW, and then I downsample it to 4K for these videos, and obviously they look fantastic. I'm going to do a little video test with the camera just so you can see the difference between ProRes on the iPhone 13 Pro Max and a $2,500 cinema camera shooting 6K with a very expensive Canon lens mounted on top of it. One new feature in this phone is that there is a macro lens. Now, what the macro lens allows you to do is get ridiculously close. You can basically have something practically touching the glass of the lens and get a crystal clear picture of it. What this allows you to do is take some really cool pictures of some things really close up. I actually use it a lot because my eyes are not great, and if I need to see a little serial number on something, or I'm trying to read something on the back of a package and I can't really see it, I snap a photo and I zoom in on it and I can see everything crystal clear, and it makes me feel like a really old man, but it does work, and it works really well. But macro photos are just a hell of a lot of fun to take. You see things that you really can't see with the naked eye, and it makes it just more exciting. So if you get this phone, I encourage you, use the macro stuff all the time. Now, I will say that the macro setting is automatic by default. What that means is when you're taking a picture of something, as you get closer and closer and closer and closer, you will see the lens actually flip on the screen, and you will see everything come into focus. As you move away from an object, you'll kind of see that flip again as it goes back to the standard lens. There is a setting in the latest update of iOS to disable that behavior, because some people didn't want the macro lens to activate. Maybe they were going for a shallow depth of field and they were pushing in on an object. Now all of a sudden there's this flip, and it was obnoxious. So Apple did give us the ability to control whether or not that's automatic or not. So keep that in mind. One of the other new camera features is a telephoto lens. It's a 3x telephoto lens. Now, what's really great about this is that you can get some really great like cityscape shots. There's something about when you see a cityscape or a really beautiful landscape, when you shoot it with a phone, it tends to just be super wide all around, and you lose the perspective and the size of things when the picture itself is just big. So if, for example, I'm taking a picture here of the New York City skyline, when I do this with the normal lens, there's so much headroom above the buildings of the sky and of the ground in front, and what ends up happening is the city itself gets really small and narrow as a strip in the middle. But when you're looking at it in real life, your eyes are really just focusing on the height of the buildings, and you're kind of ignoring all the peripheral stuff around it. So when you have a telephoto lens and you're taking shots like that, it lets you kind of crop in and cut a little bit so you don't have all that dead space around your image, and it really just makes things look more lively. Of course, in the simplest of terms, it makes things closer. It's essentially a 3x zoom that is now on the camera, but it's optical, it is not digital. So that's a nice thing to have. I mean, it's not game changing, I don't think, but it's really nice to have. And I'm happy that they put that into the new camera. In addition to the telephoto lens, one of the big improvements that Apple touted with these new phones is the low light performance. And I gotta say, the low light performance has gotten a big step better with the 13 over the 12. And I was really surprised to see such a significant difference, because honestly, going from the 10 to the 11 was enormously. The 11 seemed like it had a magical camera. And then likewise, the 11 to the 12 also made a significant improvement in low light performance. And now with the 13, it is exponential again with the low light performance. In fact, I actually find the sensor to be so sensitive in real, genuine low light situations that it looks very fake. You will often find yourself, I think, going back to reduce the exposure on a lot of these photos, especially if you're shooting in RAW. If you're not shooting in RAW, be aware when you take a picture outside at night, if it's really dark. For example, if you have a lighter and you light it and it's just gonna glow your face. In real life, you're gonna have a very soft glow on your face. The iPhone is like magical. It'll make that little light look like it's the sun, and your face will be ridiculously bright and clear, but it just doesn't look natural anymore. The last thing I wanna talk about with the photography and the camera is, of course, if you saw my iPhone 12 review, many people have pointed out that, and it's always been an issue with iPhones and a lot of cameras with tiny lenses, is that you get lens flare when you're looking into a light. Now, this is true of any camera and any lens. And usually when you see lens flare like in a movie, like a Michael Bay film, it's a really cool effect that most people ignore, and it kind of emphasizes the sun. And if you have a great lens, lens flare can be beautiful. But on an iPhone, the lens flare just appears as 2 or 3 little green dots going across your picture. So if you're doing a night shot, it now looks like there's a little UFO flying through the sky when you get these little green dots. Sometimes if you're doing something with motion, going around something, you will see that lens flare move around, and now you'll see this green dot kind of making a circle around your portrait or your picture you're trying to take when you're shooting video. Apple kind of acknowledged this, and I believe it was in the iOS 14, one of the updates, they did add post-processing software to reduce or eliminate the green dot. Unfortunately, I haven't really noticed that much of a difference, and you'll see in some of these video clips that you can still see a green dot from time to time, depending on how the picture is taken. And of course, you will see it in video as well when you've got some bright lights in a very dark area. It could be something as little as a light or a star in the sky, or something that's just going to refract on that lens and give you a little bit of lens flare. But just know that even though they may have reduced it, you'll still get the green dot from the lens flare from time to time. Easily removed in Photoshop. If it's your prize photo, don't let it ruin the picture. You can certainly fix it, but just be aware it's kind of surprising with all the processing that they do on these photos automatically to make them look so awesome. I'm kind of surprised that they haven't been able to better just eliminate the green dot, because you can really just remove it in one click on Photoshop with any of these last cameras of the past few years. So it should be very easy for Apple to identify the green dot and just wipe it from a picture. So the last thing I want to talk about is cinema mode. Cinema mode, of course, is the big feature that Apple is touting. Now, what cinema mode really is portrait mode at 30 frames a second, 1080p. And I'm going to be clear, you cannot do cinema mode in 4K. You cannot do cinema mode in 60 frames a second. That means you can't do any slow motion in cinema mode. If you want to get that shallow depth of field, it does look amazing. And what's really impressive is the ability to rack focus in post. This is something you just can't do with any traditional cinema camera. With that said, you normally wouldn't do this anyway, and I think for 99% of users using an iPhone, they don't even understand what rack focus is or why they would use it or what the purpose of it is, so you're probably never going to use it anyway. But if you are into cinematography and you are making real movies and you want them to look as real as possible, you probably will appreciate this, and it does work really well. If you're coming from the professional photo world, you know that companies like Canon and Sony have spent tons of money and energy with facial recognition, animal recognition, and object recognition on their autofocus systems, and Apple has crushed it, mainly because think about the processing power with the chips that are in these phones. Probably runs leaps and bounds around a digic processor that would be in a Canon or Sony's processors. So something to keep in mind is that if you're shooting 1080 in 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second, cinema mode works great. And it's essentially portrait mode at 30 frames a second, except you can go back and you can change the focus point after you shoot the video. It's a little cumbersome to use. I haven't quite figured it out yet. I haven't spent a ton of time with it, but it's cool. And if you're just shooting some video here and there, like, check this out. I mean, it just looks gorgeous, especially in HDR. It just looks absolutely fantastic when you're looking at it on an OLED display. The very last thing I want to discuss a little bit is ProRes. ProRes is a proprietary Apple format that has been around for a long time in professional cinema cameras. A lot of people choose to edit in ProRes because you get extremely high quality and a really good picture, but it's in a much smaller package than, for example, me shooting this in RAW. When I shoot YouTube videos, this file will be enormous, but I dump it when I'm done, and it's really not that big of a deal. I would not shoot a documentary in 6K RAW. It would just take tons and tons of storage, and offloading it alone would be a nightmare. So ProRes on a phone is almost the same thing. Even though it's much more compact than RAW, it's not nearly as flexible as shooting in RAW, but it's certainly probably a lot better than any other proprietary phone formats, and it will work in a workflow if you're using multiple cameras. So I do have the option to shoot ProRes on my Blackmagic 6K. I have the option to shoot ProRes if I have a Canon C300. If you have a Sony, you have an option. Almost everyone, if you're using an external recorder, like I use an external recorder as a monitor for my 6K that's sitting right in front of me here. And I am using a Ninja 5 monitor for that, which is also a recorder. That also records in ProRes. For the sake of consistency, if you are into cinematography and you're already shooting in ProRes, then it's really a cool feature to know that you can shoot video in ProRes, of course, like this. It will make for a consistent experience when you're pulling in ProRes from one camera, you're pulling in ProRes from a B camera, and now you can even pull in ProRes from your phone. But the files are still enormous. They're much smaller than RAW, but keep in mind that when you're shooting with, when professionals are shooting with, a RED camera, they might have terabyte SSDs and they're gonna have handfuls of them. So they might shoot 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 terabytes when this phone is 256 gigabytes. And I think the top tier of this phone is 2 terabytes. And even that would fill up fairly quickly with a few hours of high quality ProRes video. Thanks for hanging in there with me. I know we covered a lot of stuff, but the final answer to the question, is this worth upgrading to, takes some thought. It's never black or white, right? And there's always a lot of things to consider. If you are someone who does not shoot a lot of video and you're not super into photography, you're probably better off saving some money and finding a 12 Pro Max that's discounted, because the 12 and the 13 are literally identical phones when you are using them for anything other than video or photography. If you are super passionate about video and photography and you already have a 12, then yeah, you probably will want to upgrade to the 13 because of all those things that we just discussed. If you're moving from a 10, I don't know what the price differences are going to be. I know usually as you move further and further away from the previous generation of a phone, like the iPhone 12 Pro Max, those usually come down in price. So for people who said this phone is lame, it's the worst upgrade ever in an iPhone. I can see why a normal user would believe that, because quite frankly, it probably is the least exciting upgrade that Apple has ever had for the average user. If you are a power user who is shooting video, you're using your phone for everything, you're taking lots of pictures, then it's worth it. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel. I'd really appreciate it. These take a lot of work to make, which is why I don't make that many of them, but it would mean the world to me if you were to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day. I'll catch you on the next one.